Hey guys, in this section, we're going to be diving deeper into CSS for website layout. Now, we did a little bit of this when we touched upon CSS positioning in the last section, but we're going to look at some other aspects of layout, and we're going to start with the CSS display property. Previously, we've seen that when we create a paragraph element, if we examine the full border of the element with a tool like pesticide, then you can see that it actually takes up the entire full width of the web page. If we didn't want this to be the case, for example, if we wanted any paragraphs which are short enough to have the next line wrap up, then we would need to use a different element. Another type of element is something called a span. And normally you'll see the span element in the middle of another element. In this case, I've got a span open tag, and then I've got the content of it, which is the word beautiful, and then I've got the closing tag of the span. And this span is in between the paragraph element here. So we've got the hello, and then we've got the span, and then we've got the world, and then we've got the end of the paragraph element. So that's what the code for this line looks like. And the unique thing about the span element that's really cool is that it, by default, has a different value for the display property. There are three common types of display values that we're going to look at. The span has that value set to something called inline. Here's an example where we've got two H2s, and because they are set to be display inline, then they will literally display in line with each other without needing the second one to go onto a new line. By default, most elements have this display set to a value called block. And a block is exactly what it sounds like. It's a full width block. But as you can see here, we can change that value in order to change the layout of our element. This is how we would set that CSS value. We would have the property, which is display, which actually has many, many different possible values. But the three that we're going to examine today is block, inline, and finally a mixture of the two, which is called inline block. Let's take a look at each of these in turn. As I mentioned, when an element has display set to block, then it's going to take up the entire full width. Now, this means that if you have another element, then it's going to go below it, and it's not going to go onto the same line. Now, however, if the display was in line, then it means that if we had one element here, for example, a span element, and then we add another element, that's another span, then they're both going to go into the same line until we can no longer fit any more onto the width of the web page, in which case they would go to the next line. Now, one of the important things to remember about elements which are in line in their display is you can't actually set the size of these elements. You can't set the width and the height. The reason for this is because they will default to the size of their content. If you only had the word hello, then it would only be as wide as it would need to allow that element to display. And if you had a much longer sentence, then your inline element would stretch to fit that size. Keeping in mind this, if we go on to the very last type that I want to talk about, which is the inline block, what's unique about this, which is a sort of halfway point between the inline and the block, is the block element allows us to set the height and width, and the inline aspect of this setting allows us to have elements that go onto the same line. What that means is if we have two elements which are both inline block, and we have one that's say 200 by 200, and we have another that's maybe 20 by 100, then in this case, what will happen is because they're both inline block, then we can set their height and width, And because they are inline block, they can actually go onto the same horizontal line as long as there is enough space on the width of the web page. By changing this display property to block inline or inline block, we can actually determine the layout of our website. And the final one that I want to mention in the same breath is when you set the display property to none, then what that's going to do is it's going to make any element on the screen basically disappear. And sometimes this is useful when you have a button that say hides an element, or when you check off an item in the to-do list and you want it to disappear. This might be the property that you'll need. So the display property can change many, many different things. And these are just some of the values that you're going to see set on the display property quite frequently. In order to better understand this, I've created an example website for you at this address, appbaroo.github.io/css-display. And here I've got 3 elements: a block paragraph, an inline paragraph, and an inline block paragraph. So they're all paragraph elements. But you can actually change the height and width of all of these elements and see what happens to the blocks. So for example, we know that our block elements can change in height and width, but no matter how much you change the width, it's not going to bring the next line up. We know that our inline elements cannot be changed in terms of height and width because they fit to the width and height of their content. And we know that our inline block element is the one that gives us the powers of both, essentially allowing us to change the height and width, but also if the width was large, then it might need to occupy its own line. But if it's small enough, then it could fit on the same line as another inline element or an inline block element. Have a play around with this on this website to better understand this concept of these 3 display values. And then once you're done, I've got an exercise for you to practice writing the code and setting the CSS display property. Go ahead and download the starting file for 8.0 CSS Display, extract it and open it inside VS Code, and then open up the index.html. Here I've got 2 to-dos for you. There's 2 steps to this challenge. The first challenge is by changing only the display property in the CSS. So I've got a style tag here with all the CSS, and this is what you're going to change. If we take a look at the preview for the code as it is, you can see we've got 3 paragraph elements on screen. And at the beginning, it looks pretty much the same as the example website we were playing around with just now. But the only difference is we have the width and height set to 200 pixels on each of the squares. What I want you to do is to change only the display property in the CSS code right here in the index.html. And by doing that, I want you to create a web page where all 3 of these squares line up horizontally in the same way as the goal image. Remember, you're going to have to think about which type of display you're going to need in order to get all 3 of these to show up in the same size and horizontally lined up. So pause the video and give this a go now. All right, so the first thing we know is that when we have a display set to inline, it's not going to respect the height and width. First thing we have to change is this display value. So I'm going to change it to an inline block. And notice how as soon as I've changed that, it is now a 200 by 200 square. The other thing you notice is that the 2 inline blocks, so the green one and the blue one, allow this layout where they line up next to each other. Whereas this red box, which is set to block, does not, because it wants to occupy the full width of the page. So that is the one that we're going to have to change in order to achieve our desired goal. So let's change this to an inline block. And notice now, if I stretch my page so that there's enough width, then everything will actually line up onto the same horizontal. If you had it a little bit more narrow, then because it's an inline block, it will move to the next page so that it actually can show the full width of each element. But on a normal viewing screen, so if you actually opened this in a website, then you should see them lining up perfectly horizontally. The next part of this challenge is to change only the display property again, and we're going to make all three of them line up vertically like this one. Now this is cut off at the end, but you can imagine if you scroll, they're just 3 equal size squares which are all lined up vertically. And we do that by changing the display property. Pause the video and see if you can make that happen. All right, so the thing that we know about the vertical layout is in order for them to not go onto the same line horizontally, they can't have anything to do with inline. In order to achieve that vertical layout, we need to change everything to have a block display value. Because what this is telling our website is each of these elements wants all of the width to itself. Don't let it share the width with any other element. And by doing this, we end up with this vertical stacking of our elements, and we've achieved 2 dramatically different layouts just by understanding the difference between display block, display inline, and display inline block. So have a play around with that if you fancy, but otherwise head over to the next lesson where we're going to learn about another way of laying out elements using the float property. For all of that and more, I'll see you there.